Hello, hello. Welcome back to our read alouds of our I Survived the Sinking of the Titanic. So today we are going to read chapters 10, 11, and 12. Um, on Friday, when you read chapters 5 through 9, try to think to yourself what's happening in our story so far. So we kind of left at sort of a cliffhanger because George has met a new character, the scar-faced man. We don't know his actual name, but that's kind of the name that George gives him. And he went down to the baggage room because he discovered that there is a ancient Egyptian mummy princess down in the baggage room. And of course, George, being the adventurous person that he is, he wants to go down and check it out. And that's where he meets the scar-faced man. And while he's down there, that's when the ship hits the iceberg. And so we've been studying that, and we kind of know that that's a very serious situation and it's going to start sinking very quickly. So when George gets back to his room, he discovers that Phoebe is missing. And what clue did Phoebe kind of leave in the hallway and in the room that kind of helped George? Those lemon drop candies, kind of like a Hansel and Gretel type situation, so she could get back to her room very quickly. She left them so she could follow them on her way back. So we know that the ship is starting to sink. The passengers don't quite know that yet. And Phoebe's missing in that there's this dangerous passenger. We don't really know his story quite yet or what's going to happen. So let's find out. So in these sets of chapters that we're going to read today, you will start to understand the panic that is starting on the ship as it starts to sink, when passengers realize that this isn't just a fun, ooh, the ship hit the iceberg, wow, so exciting. It turned very serious very quickly. And so you'll get to understand and see what some people were going through, especially what certain class that you were in. And you'll also learn some panic that some passengers are having, and what the characters are going through as well. So let's go ahead and start reading. We are starting with chapter 10, which starts on page 51. George and Aunt Daisy scrambled to get dressed and put on their life jackets. Aunt Daisy brought Phoebe's warmest coat, and George carried the extra life jacket. They'd quickly find Phoebe and head up to the boat deck. And tomorrow morning, this would be a big joke to laugh at over breakfast. George thought that Phoebe had gone to the promenade deck, that she'd been woken up by the commotion with the ice, and figured that George had gone out to see what was happening. But when they got to the main staircase, he saw that the yellow glints were headed downstairs, not up to the deck. His heart sank. Phoebe had headed down to the first-class baggage hold because she knew that George would want to see that mummy. Of course she'd known. Phoebe could read his mind. A chill went through George's bones. But if the scar-faced man was lurking in the baggage hold when Phoebe got there? He ran faster down the stairs now. Aunt Daisy called after him, but he didn't slow down. But when he got down to G deck, there was a gate stretched across the doorway. "This wasn't here when I came down," he said to Aunt Daisy. He tried to pull it open, but it was locked. And just on the other side, there was a mob of people standing restlessly, third-class passengers from the looks of their worn clothing. "Look," Aunt Daisy said, pointing at one of Phoebe's candies glinting on the floor on the other side of the gate, pushed next to the wall. "She's down here. Pardon me," she called to the steward standing in front of the crowd. "You've gone the wrong way, madam," he said, staring at Aunt Daisy's huge diamond ring. "The captain wants first-class passengers up on the boat deck now." "My niece is down here somewhere," Aunt Daisy said. "You need to let us through." "I'm sure she wouldn't have wandered down this far," the steward said. "We're quite sure she's down here," Aunt Daisy said, "so if you'll please open the gate." "I'm sorry, madam," he said. "Regulations." "Open this gate at once," Aunt Daisy shouted in a tone George had never heard her use before. The man took a key from his pocket and opened the gate. He stepped aside to let them pass. The crowd surged forward. "Get back!" the steward shouted. "We'll tell you when it's time for you to go up." A few of them lunged toward him. Aunt Daisy grabbed George's arm. The steward took a pistol from his pocket. His hand shook as he waved it toward the crowd. George and Aunt Daisy stepped through the gate. The steward slammed it behind them. They were trapped down there, just like everyone else. George and Aunt Daisy squeezed through the crowd, weaving around trunks and stepping over sleeping children. There were so many people. If Phoebe's candies were down here, they couldn't see them anymore. Suddenly something crashed into George from behind. A pair of arms wrapped around his waist so tightly he couldn't breathe. George's heart stopped. The scar-faced man. Giorgio! Enzo screamed up at him. George's eardrums nearly split in two. Enzo's father had hurried over them. He tried to gently peel Enzo away from George, but the little boy wouldn't let go. No, he howled. No! Very sorry, Marco said, smiling apologetically at Aunt Daisy, who looked more confused than ever. We're old friends of Giorgio. George started to introduce Aunt Daisy, but before he could get 3 words out, Enzo was dragging him down the hall, elbowing his way through the crowd like a pint-sized bull. See! See! Enzo said. What? George said. No! See! See! What was this kid doing? What did he want George to see? The answer was just a few steps away, through an open doorway. It was the mail sorting room, except now all George could see was water, green water swirling halfway up the stairs, foaming and churning like a stormy river. Sacks of mail bobbed up and down. Hundreds of letters floated on the surface. And now George understood what Georgia was saying. Sea, the sea. The Titanic was filling with water from the sea. So just a little fun fact for you. So the situation that Aunt Daisy and George are in, where they're trying to get through to the 3rd class part of the ship and the gate was closed. So that is how they kept passengers from going up to the deck where the lifeboats were, was they would have gates locked, and 3rd class passengers or even 2nd class passengers could not come out of their spot of the ship until the captain gave orders that it was time for 2nd class women and children and 3rd class women and children. And as you could see, the steward, who was kind of in charge of the gate, and he was very forceful and he shouted, and he even had to get his pistol out to let passengers know, like, hey, I mean business here. You need to step back. It is not time for you to go yet until I give orders. So you need to stay here and stop pushing and shoving. So that is actually some things that happened while the 1st class passengers, the women and children, were getting onto the lifeboats. You can kind of understand the panic that's happening because 3rd class is a lot lower. So they were the first passengers to really notice that there was water coming into the boat. And as you can see, Enzo is trying to point it out to everyone. Hey, the ocean's in the ship and it's not supposed to be. So you can kind of understand why so many passengers are panicked, because they don't want to be trapped down there. They want to try and get rescued and save themselves. So let's see what happens. Chapter 11. Unsinkable, unsinkable. George whispered those words like a prayer over and over in his mind. He thought of Mr. Andrews, of how sure he was of this ship. But the longer he stared at that water, that foaming green water rising higher every second, the more certain he became. The Titanic was in trouble. We must go up, Marco said to Aunt Daisy. We find a way. But she shook her head, holding up Phoebe's bright blue coat and her life jacket. My niece, Phoebe, Aunt Daisy said. She's down here. George could see she was fighting back tears. George had never seen her look so sad and helpless, not even when Uncle Cliff died. She came down here looking for me, George said. We can't find her. Marco's amber eyes became very intent. An idea, he said. He knelt down and spoke to Enzo in Italian. The boy smiled and nodded. Then Marco hoisted the little boy up onto his shoulders. Enzo took a deep breath and screamed, Phoebe! Phoebe! People started talking and stared up at the boy with the foghorn voice. Phoebe! Phoebe! As a hush fell over the crowd, George heard a faint voice. I'm here! I'm here! The crowd parted and Phoebe appeared, her spectacles crooked, her face pale. She staggered forward and threw her arms around George, burying her face in his chest. I found you, she whispered. George didn't bother arguing over who did the finding, and anyhow, his words were stuck in his throat, so he just held her tight. It took some time for Phoebe to calm down enough to tell her story, that yes, she had been looking for George and heading for the baggage hold, that she got caught in the crowd of people rushing toward the back of the ship. It was like a stampede, she said. As Phoebe talked, Aunt Daisy helped her into her coat and life jacket. Enzo held Phoebe's hand like they were old friends. And the strange thing was that it felt that way, like they'd known Marco and Enzo forever. Maybe that's what happened when you got trapped in a flooding ship together. George stared George started to feel calmer with Phoebe close to him. But then came a deep booming sound, a kind of groaning that echoed up all around them. At first, George thought maybe the engines had started up again, but no, this wasn't the sound of the Titanic's mighty engines. The entire ship catapulted forward. People fell, toppling like dominoes. George was thrown into the wall. Screams and shouts echoed through the hallway. He managed to grab Enzo by the life jacket as he went sailing by him. Enzo just giggled as he fell into George's lap. To him, this was a fun game. George hoped he never figured out that it wasn't. What was that? Phoebe gasped, digging her fingers into George's arms. Nobody answered. They all knew. The Titanic was sinking. We will go up, Marco said. How? Aunt Daisy said. Phoebe grabbed George's hand. You, Georgie, she said. What? George said. Phoebe's right, Aunt Daisy said. You know the ship better than anyone. She turned to Marco. He's explored every inch. George couldn't believe it. They were counting on him? But what if he made a mistake? What if they all got lost? You can do it, Phoebe whispered. And so George closed his eyes, picturing Mr. Andrews's blueprints in his mind, as he remembered the escape ladders. He remembered what Mr. Andrews had told him. The ladders were in the stokers' quarters, and they run up 3 decks. He pointed toward the front of the ship. This way, he said. Let's read our last chapter for the day, chapter 12. There was no crowd here, just abandoned trunks and suitcases, and water. It was seeping into the hallway from under the doors of some of the cabins. No wonder those people were trying to push their way upstairs. They'd probably known right away that the ship was in trouble and the bottom decks were flooding. The door to the stokers' quarters was locked. Marco handed Enzo over to George and rammed the door with his shoulder, breaking the lock. George rushed inside and went to the back wall. And there it was, a ladder bolted to the wall, just like Mr. Andrews said it would be. It came through the floor and shot straight up through an opening to the ceiling. George almost laughed with relief. Bravo, George, Marco said. Bravo, Giorgio, Enzo said, clapping. George hopped up onto the ladder with Phoebe and Aunt Daisy at his heels. George was worried about Enzo, but the little guy scrambled like a monkey right ahead of Marco. They came up in a small dining room meant for crew members, and then George led everyone down a long second-class corridor, up the grand staircase, and finally out onto the crowded boat deck. They'd made it. An officer came hurrying over to Aunt Daisy. Madam, there's a lifeboat about to leave. You and the children must come at once. The man looked at Marco. Women and children only, sir, he said somberly. I'm afraid you will have to stay with the other gentlemen. Marco nodded. Yes, he said, I know. Phoebe had been right. There weren't enough lifeboats, not nearly enough. What would happen to all these men on the deck? There were hundreds of them. And what about the crew and those people down on G deck? George's heart was pounding so hard he thought it would break through his chest. He felt dizzy and sick. Marco got down on his knees and spoke very quietly to Enzo. Enzo nodded. Marco kissed him on the forehead, and then Enzo ran over to Aunt Daisy. She picked him up. I say he will go on a special boat ride, Marco said. I say you will not leave him. Aunt Daisy nodded, her eyes welling with tears. I promise you that. Marco and Aunt Daisy looked at each other. Neither of them said a word, but a whole conversation seemed to happen with their eyes. Phoebe was really crying now, looking away so Enzo wouldn't see. George felt like someone was choking him. Come on now, the officer screamed. And so they left Marco, and when George turned around just a few seconds later, he was gone. The officer led them through a crowd of men to the side of the ship, where a lifeboat hung just over the side. It was packed with people, all women and children except for 2 sailors who stood at either end. An officer helped Phoebe over the rail, and then one of the sailors reached over and pulled her into the boat. George helped Enzo, who tumbled in next to Phoebe. Aunt Daisy had a hard time climbing over in her skirts, but George held her hand and she finally made it. Now it was George's turn. As he took a step over the railing, someone pulled him back. No more room, the officer said. Women and children only. Lower away, he called. No, called Aunt Daisy, standing up in the boat. He's only 10 years old. Wait! The lifeboat rocked and almost tipped over. Ladies shrieked. You will drown us all, a woman shouted. Sit down or I'll throw you over, the sailor said. And now Phoebe was screaming too. Enzo howled. George was too shocked to move. Phoebe leaped up and grabbed hold of one of the ropes. She was trying to climb out of the lifeboat back to George. He gasped as her hand slipped and she dangled over the sea. A sailor grabbed her around the waist and threw her into the boat. And then the boat slid down on its ropes and splashed into the water. Aunt Daisy and Phoebe were shouting up at him as the sailors rowed the boat away. George stood there at the rail, watching his entire body shaking. He stood there for what felt like a long time after their boat disappeared into the darkness. He couldn't look down at the water, so he stared up at the sky, at all of those stars. He closed his eyes and told himself it was a nightmare. He was really asleep in his suite. Or no, he was home on the farm in his bed with Phoebe sleeping across the room and Papa sitting by the fire downstairs. He closed his eyes tighter. He tried to block out the terrible noises around him. He felt himself tipping to the side, and he held tighter to the rail. And then he couldn't hold on anymore. His hand slipped, and George fell, smashing his head on the deck. And then there was silence. So we are going to stop there for today, and we will finish our story by the end of the week, and you will find out what will happen to George and to Marco and all the other passengers that we have been familiar with in this story. So answer your comprehension questions and get them to me whenever you're finished, and I will see you back for our last read aloud session. Miss you. Bye.